Speaking for the trees, no matter where they're from. The podcast.
There's so much irresponsible, not just science, but also irresponsible media representation of this whole issue. It's mind-blowing when you actually start to dig into it. It really does blow my mind how bad it is.
It comes back around to the social perception again. Like that is such a big part of this, because it's like those are anecdotal things that got passed around from some professional with a social perception of animosity or of taking over or competition.
Yep.
And I've heard people who I respect, because I respect people who care and who are trying to see things and speak up for things, but they'll be like, speaking back to the invasive species being a part of colonializing energy, and it's like assuming that first of all, that all indigenous people as a group have the same perception of new plants, and secondly, that we know what that perception is, that it's not appreciating it,
Right.
And there's all kinds of things that go into that. And a lot of it has nothing to do with the exact plants that are there. It's removal from ability to be on their homelands,
Right.
to be doing things there, to be interacting so that traditional ecological knowledge, where it came from, can be continue in real time, And I found this, I started digging into that part a little bit. I've had my own experiences by meeting people as I'm wandering around, and there's a lot of different varied opinions,
Right. Totally.
But I found this, it's like a 300-page manual that came out, which was all concerning indigenous perspectives of non-native plants. And I can send it along to you. I just started to skim through it, but they would go through, each chapter was talking about a different, indigenous community in some place in the world. All of them that I started scanning through started with forced removal from the land. And then they're living in the reservation or somewhere outside of that place. And then having some feelings about like, oh, it's gotten really overgrown in here with this new plant. But they already have a name for that plant and have uses for it and stuff like that. And so, there might be a sadness of grief of it's not like it was, but also there was an adoption that's already been happening too. I mean, that's a part of our integration. It's a really popular thing now to be talking about indigenous people of the land and how we want to be listening to their perceptions and stuff like that. But that perception was a very different context than bad or good. It was a place of integration through changes too, and I'm not trying to speak for anybody on that, just like observing the containers that these things are in,
Yeah.
So like for any of it, having a different perception again would be allowing that interaction, allowing people back onto the land to be forming like what is integration here and now, and that doesn't mean we're not considering what integration with the land was before. Having plants you still want to be taking care of and bringing forward into the future that are traditional, beautiful. But it's probably going to look it's always going to look a little different because we're here now, the same way that indigenous cultures are different now because we're all living in the same world that has these different aspects going on, that has modernity, that has information through the cell phone, that these are all pieces of our perception to greater and lesser extents now, no matter where you're from.
I think about that a lot. I think about being here on this land. How can we possibly make actual reparations in action? There's lots of ways we can think about that. We can think about the land back movement and things like that. But I mean, we're just like, if we're gonna do that, if we're gonna say, that settlers can be, seen in the same light as invasive species or non-native species, which I would argue that there would be more like calling, the African population that was brought here as an enslaved, as enslaved people. They didn't come here of their own volition. We certainly don't call them settlers, right? The plants didn't intentionally come here in an act of conquest, although we say that they do. That doesn't happen. But if we're thinking of it in that terms of like, yeah, we're like the plants and we're here now. Just like the plants aren't going anywhere. We can't go back to like, I mean, I wouldn't be able to go back to where I came from because I come from so many different places and none of them would welcome me there. And, it's not an option. And so what is the way forward, right? It's not about what is the way back. It's not about trying to, turn back time. It's about what is the way forward and how can we actually be here on this land and sharing it with the people that were here, the plants that were here before us.
Yeah.
And I think it's a very difficult conversation to have in some aspects because there's so much grief, there's so much shame, there's so many different things that go into that. There's a lot of guarding, I think, on, from different perspectives, and I can totally appreciate and empathize with that, and I know for myself, like a lot of like conflict about what that looks like. But the reality is that just like the plants are showing us how to move into a space and integrate, it's part of, like you're saying, and there are lots of different opinions about this from Indigenous communities, but I've seen a lot of the same thing. They embrace those types of changes. They don't necessarily embrace being colonized by any means, but certainly embrace new plants moving into the landscape and, like you said, giving them names and finding uses for them, and they embrace that. That's from our ethnocentric viewpoint that we think that Indigenous people don't change because we've relegated them to that stasis, to that just the same thing that we do with the land, that they were this thing, they're in the past, they always stay the same.
Yeah.
And that's just not true. They're moving, dynamic, just like everything else. And they're, generally speaking, from what I can tell, much better at it than we are. And adapting to change. The fact that we still have Indigenous people here is testament to that.
Yeah.
So I think, and again, I always go back to what are the plants showing us? What is the lesson from the plants? And it's how to be here. And as long as we continue to see their energy as colonizer energy, and see things in that perspective and not see all the beautiful ways that they're trying to create relationship and trying to integrate, trying to create mutualistic and symbiotic relationships and co-evolve with everything that is here, we're never going to learn how to do that ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
I've spent a lot of time reflecting on this and thinking, am I being defensive of these plants because of my own history and my own, ancestry and stuff like that? Is that possibly where that's coming from? And I really have spent a lot of time reflecting on that. And I think that's something that people should do, reflect on that in general. But what I've come to is that I really just want to be able to be home, to like belong somewhere. And I think that, like we talked about, a landscape cannot sustain any creature that lives on it that doesn't integrate into it. And so we have to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I do feel a lot of like, I feel like we need to push back against that narrative that plants are colonizers, because that's us imposing our own major baggage onto them instead of allowing them to show us who they really are. We need to stop doing that to plants. It's, and that's one of the ways in which we do that.
Yeah.
And especially, I think that if we look at it also in terms of the fact that many of these plants have adapted specifically to human disturbance, right?
Right.
They're good at growing in farm fields. They're good at growing along fence rows. They're good at growing along irrigation ditches. They're used to it. Like that. That's what they've gotten good at. And so we make that them coming over here and following us. That's also why they would be good teachers for us, is because they've been dealing with our shit this whole time. Right. So yeah, in that way they can be teachers and helping us to figure out how to deal with our shit, you know. And in terms of them being colonizers, this also comes into play, because it's like, well, wait a minute, this is nature, you know, taking a gander at the situation, being like, okay, this particular disturbance that just got made here, where you did a clear cut, or you drained a swamp, or you know, whatever it is that you put in this road. Yeah, I've got the ones for that. Here they are. You know what I mean? Like, they're fixing it. Like, no, they're not part of the colonization. No, they're part of nature's response to our colonization. I've been really upset to see this narrative making the rounds that, oh, these plants are colonizers too. It's like, no, that sounds an awful lot like trying to foist off some of us onto them, you know? It's like, no, actually, we need to own this one, okay? We need to own this one, and that means not blaming them in that way, you know?
Right, absolutely, yeah.
I mean, I just think about the plants I've been following around that I was introduced to, and you know, especially the lomatiums and the Simopterus, those umbels. There's like so many different varieties. And a part of that, I think, is because people were moving around with them, and there is such that connection there that you end up having all of these different expressions of those foods, you know, because they were hanging out with these people over here, you know, and these ones were hanging out with them over there. And we call them different varieties or species now, but I think they probably had some similar roots and kinship made that diversity, you know, and people would adopt new foods that they liked and be paying attention to how they integrated into the landscape. That's how we can call the wilderness an untouched place, not recognizing the deep fingerprints of human interaction. You know, like the desert, the Great Basin has been fascinating for that. You know, you find the densities where people were hanging out. And you find the densities shrinking when you've removed those people. Yeah. So we don't really know what our perceptions in the response might be if we actually had that reconnection to engagement with the landscapes. I'm sure that it would look different than it used to, but if we wanted to have, like, I love these plants. That's why it's so funny to me that people would maybe assume that I'm saying I don't care about them, when it's like I dedicated 10 years of my life to just following them, you know, and gathering their seeds and planting them. Like, I'm heavily invested in them continuing, you know. I'm not trying to make it like anything goes. It's all subjective. But if I wanted to be successful in conserving those plants, in helping them continue, I would have to really be willing to understand the relationships that make that possible. And I might not be able to get those same plants on that same hillside if all the water in the water table has been drained somewhere else. I might have to come up with something else. I might have to bring them a little further over there, or have them in the mixture with other things, you know? Like, I've been planting a lot of these plants in cheatgrass patches because cheatgrass isn't really in the way of them. You know, it's just cheatgrass is growing in places that have powdered soils instead of the cryptobiotic soils, because we've had grazing out there and fire and probably a hotter soil temperature, you know. So how do I try to work with those things, you know, so that I'm successful at continuing those kinships, you know?
Yeah, and just like we can't say that we can that fortress conservation mentality, apply that to a landscape or to plants or whatever, we can't apply that to people either. Yeah. Right. So, you know, if people do want to think of, you know, settlers and invasive species from a similar mentality, if that's where you're approaching that from, it's like, you can't, we're still here participating and consuming and being part of, you know, the economic and ecological structures that allow us to live on a daily basis. So we have to integrate. We have to, not just ecologically, but socially, right? We have to learn how to coexist, and we have to rediscover what that looks like. Because if we don't, then it's not like, you know, everybody goes down, the whole system goes down. You know, it's not like one. Certainly, there's disparity, and certain people suffer more than others because of the way that the system is set up. But in the long run, in the big picture, if we don't pull it together and learn how to have these conversations across the board, and honor that everyone deserves to have a place to call home, no matter where their home was in the past, where their ancestors' homes were, and not go about that through violence. I don't know how. I don't see a path forward for us if we can't figure that out. And again, I think the plants I think the plants have the blueprint for that. They're showing us how you can do that. But because we're imposing our own issues onto them, we're seeing it as a reflection of our own issues. It's exactly, our own problems.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Speaking for the Trees, no matter where they're from, is also a blog at kollibri.substack.com. That's kollibri.substack.com. Paid subscribers get exclusive blog posts and early access to podcast episodes. Intro beats by Big Joe Drummer. This outro music by Codebox. Join us again for another episode of Speaking for the Trees, no matter where they're from, the podcast.